I wanted to introduce our next speaker, Yorke, who I mentioned earlier on. He's co-founder of blockchain at Microsoft and principal program manager in Azure, Microsoft's really blockchain initiatives, because I know certainly his work spans a number of different areas, and more recently as well, there was a significant award that Microsoft got for innovations in supply chain, which I don't know if Yorke's going to be talking about today, but if you haven't seen it, it's awesome to check out. So he's got a great amount of perspective that he brings to the table here.
Thank you very much, Connor. Excited to be here as always. I'm going to share a presentation that I use for sort of internal updates on the work that we're doing, that's basically my day job work. As Connor mentioned, I took Microsoft on this journey starting in 2015 after having my personal blockchain discovery, and then sort of navigating my way through convincing myself that the technology was as remarkable as I thought it would be in its ultimate state, the ultimate state meaning public blockchain. And then was very fortunate to get introduced to Joe Lubin of ConsenSys in 2015 when the company was about 5 people. So we really looked to Joe as an early mentor on my journey and consistent collaborator over the years. And we're still doing quite a bit with ConsenSys as well. From a journey perspective, I started my journey really informing Microsoft's journey through an open source lens. So really watching and informing our teams and the engineering team what was going on in the open source community, and who and how should we partner in the community in a way that made sense and in a way that from a large enterprise perspective was acceptable and made sense to Microsoft as a business, but also was very circumspect about this new thing called cryptocurrency and tokens, and how Microsoft would be perceived by being in this market, and obviously looking always, as large enterprises do and large brands do, at reputational risk, among other things. And just to that point, I think what is actually driving a lot of the sustainability goals for the blockchain community is the reputational risk of large enterprises that are interested in using the technology, including Microsoft. So that's sort of broadly my journey. I actually joined the Azure blockchain engineering team, which hosted the portfolio of products that we've developed over the years. We're able, actually, in collaboration with ConsenSys, to ship a first product, Visual Studio plugin for Solidity development, to really get blockchain development in the hands of Visual Studio developers in conjunction with ConsenSys and Juan Blanco. And there's obviously still great tooling there that exists in both the open source market as well as in our version of that. And then in my role in the blockchain engineering team, I was helping Microsoft's most advanced client users to really navigate the space in the context of an Azure cloud implementation of technology and a full stack implementation of technology. And so this is really, sort of Microsoft as a trusted partner to enterprise, helping enterprises understand, what's on the other side of the chasm, and then how to navigate through that. And if you look at the journey of blockchain and the way enterprises have navigated blockchain, it's actually very similar to the way enterprises navigated the early internet, where they had a lot of concerns about what was going on in this open source community, and what was the internet and how do they take advantage of that, and when they do decide to stick their toe in the water, what does it mean, and how do they create value out of that without creating reputational risk. So in my role, I would steward many different client projects. Just a couple of examples: I worked on the World Bank blockchain bond project, which was a 2-year bond. and that was really one of the first blockchain bond projects using blockchain technology, and that was in collaboration with the World Bank and the Commerce Bank of Australia. So that's one customer example. Another customer example is our internal Xbox royalties project, which is using Quorum. Oh, by the way, the World Bank project was using proof of authority, Ethereum proof of authority, running on Azure, combination of Azure and Google Cloud. And then the Xbox royalties project is running Quorum, and the project that I currently steward full-time in my day job is actually in our cloud's hardware supply chain. Now, the interesting thing about this particular project, and this is the one that Connor mentioned, and I'll just start sharing my screen now to talk about that project. Connor mentioned that we have won an award. We actually won 2 awards that we submitted for last fall. And the awards were basically through Gartner. And for those folks who know enterprise, you know that a lot of enterprises listen to Gartner as a strategy sort of directional organization. And so what we did was we applied for an award in their supply chain group, and we wound up winning the Technology Innovation Award. And then from that, it gets culled down into essentially a community vote, and we wound up winning the Breakthrough of the Year award. So had I predicted that we would actually be able to get Gartner talking about blockchain as a Breakthrough of the Year award or even a Technology Innovation Award, I would be very wealthy. I did not predict that we would have that success on this journey. So so that's sort of the recognition, really good for a blockchain person like myself to be able to get that type of recognition. I think that's a really good milestone for the blockchain community. So on the right-hand side is really what the project is. We have implemented for our hardware supply chain. Basically, this is the high-value components that go into the servers and racks that go into our data centers worldwide. For reference, this is a business inside of Microsoft. It's a revenue line, just like Xbox is a revenue line, and Office and Dynamics are revenue lines. And the cloud revenue line is a $60 billion per year revenue line. Without these components and this hardware value chain or supply chain, we could not deliver that $60 billion in revenue. So in the first phase of this journey, we had 9 participants. They're not all listed here, but basically Microsoft is playing a purchaser role or a buyer role. And then we have a bunch of systems integrators who help build the racks, and hub and logistics providers who actually move the goods, as well as the manufacturers of the high value commodities. And high value commodities is a relatively finite market in the high tech space. It's about 20 total manufacturers. And those manufacturers manufacture things like SSD, DRAM, CPU, GPU, hard drives, basically all of the high value components that are smart components. They have firmware logic inside of them, etc. And so that's what this project is a foundational part of our cloud work. We were able to actually demonstrate that we could achieve, through the improvements in traceability, visibility, and detailed tracking of the individual components, about $50 million in savings per year. And so very meaningful project for an enterprise, which also then, of course, allows you to continue investing in seeing this through. Now, phase 2 of the journey is the next 12 essentially high value commodities supply chain participants. We're working on that now, and that will take us through essentially about mid next year, when we'll have all of those participants on board. And we're introducing a banking partner into this blockchain as well as a core component, essentially to participate in the financial flows. So really a great success story in the industry, from a size, name brand recognition, value return, as well as core to a business function. I'm going to jump through just a couple of things I think will be interesting to you. I won't go through this, but there are other awards besides the innovation award that we won that others, other brands win as well. To give you a sense of what this slice of our supply chain looks like, we have manufacturers, logistics providers, the systems integrators, and then the end client is our data center, where we basically deliver these capabilities in a rack, effectively giving an actualized digital twin of what that rack is, because we know very specifically what the components are that are in that rack. And so in addition to the physical custody, ownership, and transfer of those high value commodities, we also track obviously all of the requisite paperwork associated with, when a manufacturer issues goods for delivery to a warehouse or a hub provider. The hub provider is issuing an invoice based on the purchase order. So there's a whole flow of shipment contracts as well as financial contracts associated with this. I'm going to skip down just to give you a sense of what an enterprise journey looks like. The first conversation we had on this was in 2018. We are in production now, finally. We started last fall, ramping up into production for the phase 1 of this journey, and then we're working on phase 2, as I mentioned, over the next 12 months. A lot of this journey, particularly the early part of this journey, is internal sponsorship, stakeholder engagement, validation, scoping, trying to get to an MVP scope that's achievable, getting alignment across not just Microsoft, but the other 8 parties that are involved in this, and then obviously budgeting for it, and then engaging with a partner. In our case, we have partnered with Accenture for various reasons. Accenture is actually a very big vendor supplier to Microsoft. Does a lot of work in our supply chain already, so they have a lot of context and knowledge of what we're doing there. And so, that's just to give you a sense of the journey. When we think about data, I won't go into this particular one, but when we think about data that's important, there's about 120 approximate fields that are important in almost any supply chain. So, the same types of data fields show up in our phase 1 project, which was DRAM and SSD. And this type of data, a lot of this data has very significant competitive information in it. And so, as Ben and I were talking about before, there's definitely concerns about where data resides, because any metadata or encrypted data can be mined for long periods of time, and you can eventually get something out of it. From a competitive perspective. So this is one of the big challenges that enterprises have with public blockchain, is how do I protect my data from competitors? And you could make that same exact quote about the internet in the early 90s, right? This is no different than that situation. So, this is really the navigation through this value proposition and risk concerns is very similar to how enterprises would have navigated something as foreign as the internet at the time. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but there are about 11 different, very specific data points that make up that $50 million. And we've done 3 value case analyses to revalidate the approximate $50 million based on some assumptions, and help people understand how we got to that number. We've also done some extrapolation to other participants besides Microsoft to help our value chain partners understand their value proposition on being a participant in this. And we've also what it would look like for to introduce other buyers into the conversation in the role that Microsoft is currently playing. And could you extrapolate the same type of data savings for those particular buyers? And the answer is yes. We've done a number of value case analysis that anticipate other buyers in a network like this. So as an example, when we sort of articulate just visually what has been built, we've built a network and a network effect and onboarded people directly as decentralized members of that network. In other words, all of the services are running in a decentralized application stack. Now, granted, in the first iteration of this, they're all running on Azure, so not the concept of decentralization we would expect in a blockchain hybrid network, but possible to get there. This is just a MVP scoping effort to avoid complexity. And then we built very specifically a Microsoft application on that network that we now have our value chain participants participating in. So as you look at expansion in a model like this, you can think about, well, what about one of those other participants like Lenovo? Do they have a similar problem? Are they trying to achieve the same problem? What about enterprise application providers like in ERP systems and many others, right? There's a number of well-known brands that do that work. Could we get them more closely aligned to this type of pattern? So we're actually working very closely with SAP and very closely with Dynamics on doing just that. I'm going to move down here to an application stack view. This is a pretty high level architectural application stack view. What you can see here is sort of the white boxes and the manila colored boxes represent the operational capability of the system. And then the manila boxes represent the data warehouse and reporting side of the system. And in the middle of that and connecting it is basically the blockchain transaction layer. You can see there's common interfaces in getting how you would actually do things at scale into a blockchain, and then getting data out of blockchain using a tool like the ETHLogger tool from Splunk, which is open source that we've contributed to basically transform your data into a way that makes sense from a business objects perspective, so that you can use that for reporting, visualization, data analytics, et cetera, et cetera. And then on top of this, you need alerting tools. Some alerting tools need to basically alert the next party in a transaction workflow that they should do something. So that's partly what that's for. We've also demonstrated leveraging things like Slack channels and Teams channels for collaboration about the data objects that exist on chain. So there's a sort of a lot of landscape that we've been exploring. I'll continue down here. One other point about this, I mentioned that this is a full application stack. We're surfacing up an API and we're connecting that API into ERP systems like SAP and Dynamics and warehouse management systems across all these parties. This application stack runs in the owned Azure tenant of each of these participants. So it is a decentralized network effect, again, with the caveat that it's currently on one cloud. But obviously using Quorum, and we're working closely with the consensus on the migration to full open source Quorum. You can do cross-cloud or hybrid scenarios if people would like to do that. And then we also have some rudimentary web-based user experience that we've developed and will continue to develop. That is a shortcut because doing an API integration for an enterprise is not usually something that's easy. And so the web-based interface gives us a path to do that. I'm going to show two more pictures and then I will pause and take some questions. This is sort of the full vision of what we are thinking about in terms of conceptually here. The idea of mine to data center traceability, including end of life, is something that's very important for a number of different reasons. We would like to be able to have traceability guarantees in a transparent way to validate that we're not sourcing from conflict sources. And in particular, in the case of Cobalt, which exists in almost every high-tech chip, about 20% of the sources of Cobalt come from conflict mines. And the reason they're conflict mines is because they're basically not run by a large mining organization like Rio Tinto or BHP or any other mining organization. They're what I think is a mislabeled artisanal mines, basically like smallhold farmer type of mines that are typically people of all ages, including children, digging in the dirt with their hands or very minimal tooling, and then also creating fairly significant personal health concerns as well as environmental concerns, and then they're not seeing the value out of the labor. So there's some incentive issues in the cobalt mines that need to be addressed. What we're trying to do initially is make sure that we are not sourcing from those mines, and then we can prove that. And then secondly, we're also working with our internal humanitarian organization focused on how do we actually work in the market to understand the incentives that are causing child labor, for example, and how do we help to change those incentives in those particular locations. And in my personal view, how could blockchain identity and wallet technology actually have an impact on that? On the other end, the goods that come out of a data center actually, in a lot of cases, can be reused, and so they get injected back into the supply chain for reusage. They sometimes will then go to end of life and then need to be disposed in various ways. We need that traceability as well per regulations around how things are disposed. So there's a real end-to-end story here around taking raw materials into composite materials, into chips, into servers and racks, and then end of life, and also the return path. That there's a lot of help here from a technology like this. I'm not going to show these. One other slide I want to show. Part of phase 2 of our journey actually showcases, as I mentioned, introduction of very collaborative ERP system integration. This is a Microsoft view, but anybody else who's doing ERP integration would have a similar view. One of the challenges with ERP systems is that they're very good at one-to-one relationships, but not good at indirect relationships. And the way these supply chains operate is they are mostly indirect relationships. And so when we did architecture work to try to solve for our future state, we realized that it would be a lot easier to do it if we had a system that dealt with end-tier relationships quite well. And so we basically have fused blockchain into our go-forward architectural plan for our solution, essentially. And then it also includes financial controls, financial integrity as well, and actually having a banking partner as part of this environment. So I think I'll stop there and let folks ask questions. Does that sound good, Connor?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me scroll down here. So question from Mike K. What do you think will be the signpost that the network can or will substantially be able to overcome the inherent security risk you point to? And how do companies such as yourselves think about operating on a public permission blockchain?
So there's various approaches. Fans of the baseline protocol, which I was a co-founder of, look at that. It's a very heavy zero knowledge proof type of implementation. That's a possible approach. I do think that enterprise side chains to a public chain is actually what a quorum-based implementation looks like in some ways. So we sort of think about, can we model that in a private context such that in the future we could actually migrate components over into a public context. The question there also becomes like, why and when, and is it necessary? Like, what's the purpose of that? The other methodology is like, if you identify the very specific purpose that you want to use public blockchain for, then do it just for that purpose, right? Don't actually just wholesale migrate onto the internet because you can. Make explicit choices about what data you want to expose on the internet. And this is, again, very similar to the web-based environment that we live in today, right? Corporations do not expose their business processes generally holistically on the internet. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on inside the corporate firewalls. And that will continue to be the case in blockchain scenarios. We have not seen that change in the internet, really. So I don't foresee that changing longer term. As I was talking to Ben earlier about, the potential of optimistic rollups as side chains that don't store data on a main chain. That's certainly a viable opportunity to the extent that we can limit metadata leakage and the opportunity for people to mine. Using the term mining is like doing data crunching to try to de-encrypt stores of data. I would also say that one other public blockchain problem set is the cross-border problem. Enterprises all work in the context of governmental borders, and there are different regulations and requirements about data as well as transaction types cross borders. And within those government-defined geographically laid out commerce borders that we have to comply with as enterprises. And so that's another challenge that has to be planned for and mitigated against. And it also goes to the last point that I was going to make, which is enterprises don't like other people touching their data. And certainly in the case where they don't know who's touching their data, that's I would say an underlying problem that would also have to be addressed. Now, if you go back to my point about an enterprise sidechain, you address a lot of those problems with an enterprise sidechain, and whatever way that makes sense to actually achieve that is fine, right? Like nobody has to choose, not everyone has to choose the same approach.
Thanks, Yorke. Were there any other questions that anyone wanted to ask? Everything we have in the chat. If not, I was going to ask Yorke just about you showed that slide with all of the different fields that and spoke about how sensitive that data was. How did you address the kind of privacy concerns there? Was it making use of the kind of baseline protocol type approach, or was there kind of another way that you did it?
Yeah, so we're heavily reliant. Well, we're using Quorum, so we're heavily reliant today on Quorum privacy groups to achieve the necessary privacy of data among participants. The Quorum privacy groups do actually achieve some of the goals that I mentioned earlier. One, it's fully encrypted among the named participants to those groups who are the holders of those keys. Secondly, a Quorum privacy group, and this is implemented with Tessera, obviously. The data doesn't flow on the main chain in the private Quorum blockchain network. It only flows among those named members. So it does achieve the problem of, I don't want someone to be able to mine data over a long period of time and be able to discover things about patterns. Now, that does introduce other complexities around managing those privacy groups, managing the introduction of new members in those privacy groups, kicking members out of privacy groups, a problem you can't solve for in any technical approach. But we are, we're very happy about the merge on the consensus between Quorum and the Besu teams, and the merge also of the privacy layers. Besu has a couple of features in the privacy layer that's better than Tessera. So those are coming together, and it'll be essentially the best of both approaches. So that's a very good thing from a privacy perspective. We have thought about potentially using some zero knowledge proof capabilities. We've thought about how might we expose the relevant proofs, for example, that we're not using conflict minerals, and that could be done certainly through zero knowledge proof approach. And those types of proofs could be done on a common Quorum chain, or they could be done on a public blockchain, right? That I don't think there would be much difference there. The question really comes down to, back to the point I made earlier, like, why do you want to use the public chain? What is your use case for it? I can definitely see a use case where you would say, well, I want certain ability for someone to validate that what I'm telling them is true. And then secondly, I want it to be accessible not just to the participants in my blockchain, my private blockchain network, but also to anyone in the world, right? So it's more of a sort of a web page question, right? Like, can I publish it on my web page with the backing guarantees that what I'm saying is true, right? And so that's, you know, one scenario that we thought of where it would be valuable to utilize something besides the private blockchain environment to actually facilitate that. And so I think one of the things that to take away from this discussion is there's a very specific proprietary use case of goods movement, goods valuation, specific to you know, a $60 billion revenue line business that in its first two implementations is happening in the context of a private chain for a lot of good reasons, right? From a privacy perspective. Whether or not that changes in the future, I don't know. You would have to have very specific use cases like the transparency on conflict minerals one that would drive you to do something else. Do I think that in any scenario that whole thing could be lifted and shifted into a public chain environment? The basic question is going to be, what's the effort and what's the benefit from an enterprise perspective, and what are the risks, and can you get the other parties to agree, right? You know, if as a sort of, you know, I'll say this tongue in cheek, bleeding edge technology company, Microsoft, versus other members of our supply chain, typically supply chain operations folks are highly conservative. And not that technology savvy, and in most cases understand everything about the goods they're moving, but not a whole lot about a software stack that's appropriate to actually help make things better. So, you know, the conversations and the security reviews about data are probably the primary blocker to doing anything. And, you know, we've gone through those full stack security reviews on our current application with those parties, right, where they've run their own security reviews full stack. So
awesome, and thank you, Yorke. Before we oh, sorry, yeah, go on.
Yeah, and I was going to say, you know, on another data point, you know, companies who are following open source software and standards obviously will see value propositions in open source smart contract libraries like OpenZeppelin, or open source standards like ERC token standards. And so when we evaluate our solution, first version of our solution was using 100% smart contracts, had way too many tight controls that sort of hampered our ability to run the operations effectively. So we've loosened some of those controls, and something you want to think about from a smart contract development perspective. And then also following the standards, we've migrated some of those smart contracts over to ERC standards like the NFT standard because these are unique assets, right? And so using something like an NFT standard works quite well for a serialized good. And the other data point here is we're actually using IPFS, a private IPFS network, as well to facilitate large amounts of off-chain data. Connor, you pointed out the 120 data fields. Like if you tried to do all of that stuff on chain, it would become unwieldy. And so we're using IPFS, very similar to its usage in a public Ethereum context, to store large amounts of data of varying sizes in a essentially private network scenario. And we've also did sort of a brute force implementation of, can we map IPFS to the privacy groups of Tessera as an initial pass. We'll probably actually look to improve that through work with both IPFS and the Quorum team over time, but we effectively have a IPFS mapped into our privacy groups, which facilitates, again, some of the same constraints that we have defined as required for data. And that brings me to another data point, which is, you know, I look and have been talking for a couple of years about what are signals about crossing the chasm, you know, for this technical approach. notwithstanding, some of the work that I've showcased today and some of the awards that we've gotten, I think NFTs as a phenomenon are a classic example of crossing the chasm, where people are seeing value in NFTs who have no understanding of the underlying protocol. And this is what happened on the internet. It's the same thing, right? People do e-commerce transactions, get huge value out of the internet without any understanding of the underlying protocol. And so this is why we're seeing the growth that we're seeing in the NFT market. And it's an extremely exciting development, because this is the moment where we'll see a lot of brands, and you're already seeing this, embrace public blockchain because of what it actually gives you from an NFT value proposition perspective. Now, on the risk side of that, do those brands know what they're buying when they buy into the promise of an NFT? And then secondly, do they know who they're buying it from, and what is it really meeting the promise of NFTs, right? That's always the risk when you have people who are making purchase decisions that is away from the core technology underneath. So as I advise Microsoft brands internally about this, that's one of the key things that we do, is we talk about, like, how does the full stack of an NFT actually meet the promise that you want in an NFT, and therefore withstand the reputational risk to Microsoft as a brand when someone shows you how it's not meeting the promise, right? So openness, transferability, not a locked ecosystem, not a locked marketplace. Those are all really important when you evaluate public blockchain NFTs, to really get the value proposition behind the promise of an NFT.
It's been really fantastic to have you sharing your insights here. And I think what's so fascinating too is, of course, you're demonstrating tangible savings as well, for these businesses across the supply chain with the work that's happened here. So it's, of course, so many people talk in terms of, what are the problems that blockchain is solving, and being able to actually articulate the impact it has there is certainly, a thing that we want to see more of, and it's really helpful and great to see what's happened there. So if everyone could give Yorke a virtual round of applause, just as a thank you